Thank you very much, Louise. Well, good afternoon, everybody. By a couple of minutes, very warm welcome to everybody for attending the launch of our inspection report on the national arrangements for the probation service. I really wanted to provide some context for our report ahead of us launching into what we found. We all know that the probation service has been under huge pressure in recent years. It's faced significant change over the last decade, and that pressure is likely to continue with the sentencing review and other changes coming down the line. Now, since my appointment as Chief Inspector of Probation in March of last year, 100% of the probation areas that we've inspected have been rated either inadequate or requires improvement. And indeed, if you look back at our previous inspection programme, the findings were very similar, with only one area rated as good under the last inspection programme. Now, whilst I have publicly commented and commended the hard work of probation officers for the hard work that they've been done, indeed I would describe it as heroic at some of the efforts that have taken place on a day-to-day basis, particularly last summer in response to the SDS 40 changes. The reality is that the service currently has too few staff with too little experience managing too many cases. I would also add perhaps that they do not have the tools they need to undertake the vital job that they are undertaking. Now that matters because the probation service are absolutely critical to reducing reoffending and protecting the public. Probation at its best, we know from the evidence, has the capacity to be truly transformative, changing lives for the better, reducing reoffending, resulting in fewer victims and safer communities. But at present, the bottom line is it is not making the difference that they, we, or the public would want. And against that backdrop, we decided that we needed to undertake a national inspection to examine the effectiveness of the national arrangements to support the frontline delivery. Our inspection concluded that nationally, the arrangements require improvement. In essence, we found there are major shortfalls in the national arrangements and an urgent need for improvement to keep the public safe and reduce reoffending. This event provides hopefully the opportunity to hear about our findings, ask questions. I also think it's a timely report, given that we are anticipating that the sentencing review will be published shortly, and we know that whatever decisions are made following that review, it will have significant implications for the probation service, and it needs to be match fit for change that is coming along the line. Now, the real pleasure about leading this event is I will say a few words at the front, and then I'll ask Mr. Argument, who led this inspection, to take you through the findings. Dave, over to you.
Thank you very much, Martin, and good afternoon, all. It is afternoon, 5 minutes past midday. I'm Dave Argument. I'm currently the head of the probation inspection programme at HMI Probation. I led the team of HM inspectors and assistant inspectors who carried out this national inspection earlier this year. I'll just start by giving you a bit of background into the kind of context of the report. So HMPPS, that's His Majesty's Prison and Probation Service, for those of you who are not employed by HMPPS, they're responsible for the supervision of around about 250,000 people on probation across England and Wales, just under 240,000 people. And the way in which HMPPS is governed is there are national arrangements. It's a national organisation with a national agency leadership team, but underneath that there are prison and probation areas, which you can see on the map that's on the slide in front of you, and then within those there are probation regions. So we were interested in the extent to which national leadership, national policy, national strategy was having a bearing on what we've been finding at the front line. In effect, we broke this inspection down into two halves. So the first half involved us taking a sample of cases which was selected from each of the 12 probation regions across the country, and we looked at 165 of those in total. And the second half involved us meeting with leaders, staff, partners, a strategic level of HMPPS at a national level, and that included senior national executive directors, non-executive directors, regional and national leaders, and staff involved in the delivery of work. And by combining those two halves together, we intended to comment on how activity at a national level was having a bearing on the quality of frontline delivery. And I think we're good to move to the next slide. Thank you. And so to structure our findings, we reported on 4 areas, and they were leadership, staffing, services, and infrastructure, and ICT. And you can see from the slide that the overall rating we gave to national arrangements was requires improvement, and we rated each of those 4 areas individually as well. So you'll see that 3 of those were rated as requires improvement, and services were rated as inadequate. We didn't rate the casework we inspected specifically. Instead, we used the findings from the casework that we looked at from across the country to inform the ratings that you can see on the slide in front of you. So that's the findings of the inspection overall. I think we're good to move on to the next slide. Thank you. So let me guide you through each of those 4 areas in a bit more detail, and I'll just draw out some of the kind of important points. And by all means, as I'm working through, if there's bits that you're particularly interested in, and you'd like us to expand on, then please do ask when we get to the questions at the end of the presentation. So far as leadership was concerned, what we found was there were some strengths here. So we found that management information, intelligence about operational performance was actually quite strong, and it was giving national leaders the information they needed to make defensible decisions. We also found that, we were really pleased to see that there was a strong culture of openness, and leaders were willing to be challenged at a national level, which was healthy, and which we felt was a good foundation for how we think the probation service ought to move forward in future. But the quality of leadership was really undermined by the effectiveness of support to make sure that the quality of work on the front line was sufficient. So the actions that senior leaders had taken and national leaders had taken to drive forward quality at the front line hadn't been effective enough and weren't materializing in the cases that we inspected, or indeed in the work we inspect through our PDU level inspection on a routine basis. And what we found is that lines of accountability for that quality delivery were often unclear, and were not leading often enough to reasonable quality work in local communities. So I think that's the kind of key points from leadership. I'll move on to staffing. Thank you very much. And again, on staffing, we did see some improvements and some positive findings. So recruitment in particular, across all frontline roles, has been relentless, supported by the Extraordinary Jobs campaign that many people on the call will be familiar with. That has led to more people being employed as probation practitioners, more people in post as unpaid work supervisors, as case administrators, and so on. But there was still a big difference between the number of probation practitioners, and particularly probation officers, the agency projects that it needs, and the number of people in those posts. So the gap between the number of people, number of practitioners that the service needs to deliver a reasonable level of service, and the number of people who are actually in post is still too high, and that has an impact obviously on the workloads that people have at the front line. And high workloads across the organisation and across grades meant that time for good quality professional development, for consolidation of learning, and applying that into practice was really limited, and getting in the way of good quality delivery. And as with our inspection of local probation delivery, we found that management oversight was consistently insufficient. So what that meant was the practitioners were not always receiving the right support and direction from senior probation officers, and indeed from more senior managers at times in casework when they needed it. So our overall rating on staffing was one of requires improvement. I think we're ready for the next slide. Thank you very much. Turning to services then, when we talk about services, we're talking about services for people on probation, so help for those people to turn their lives around, and services more generally in terms of public protection work. We found a number of concerns on this front, which are summarised on the slide in front of you. Overall, the national strategy and approach we found was not leading to good quality support for people on probation often enough, and was not doing enough to protect potential victims from harm. And obviously, we recognise that the service can't eliminate risk, but there were big gaps in terms of the extent to which public protection work was being woven into the way in which services were commissioned and delivered. And our inspection of casework actually was particularly concerning, and you can see some stats on the screen there. So, just under a fifth of cases were being found to be sufficient in relation to keeping other people safe, and just under a third were found to be sufficient in terms of support for desistance. So there's real distance for this service to travel in terms of the quality of work to help people turn their lives around, and also really concerningly in terms of work to protect the people who may be at risk from harm. So services we rated as inadequate, and I think we're ready to move on to infrastructure and ICT. Thank you very much. This was the final area of our inspection, and as the slide shows, it was focused on infrastructure and ICT. We did find a great deal of work being done by digital teams, many of whom were committed, really skilled teams to help practitioners at the front line to do their jobs effectively. And there were lots of improvements actually that were scheduled in the pipeline, lots of bespoke work that had taken place recently to make probation practitioners' lives easier from an efficiency point of view. But the main IT systems that practitioners use on a day-to-day basis remain clunky, they're outdated, they're complex, time-consuming to use, and the effect of all of that is that we found practitioners weren't able to do what they needed to do effectively enough. So whether that was sharing information with other agencies, whether it was freeing up time to spend with people on probation in the room and with partners, it has those inefficiencies have a huge impact on the work that practitioners are doing, that complexity. And then separately, in relation to the buildings that are used by HMPPS for probation service delivery, we found significant issues on this front. So there's been years of prolonged underinvestment in the probation estate. The effect of that is that we've got buildings that just aren't fit for purpose, that are demoralizing to work from, in some cases that aren't accessible for disabled people, and in some cases not completely safe. So much more needs to be done on that front. There was some really committed work taking place through estates planning, and lots that have been achieved, but a great deal of distance yet to travel to make sure that the estate is up to scratch in terms of its suitability for people on probation and the people who work in those buildings. So that was the kind of headline findings from infrastructure and IT. Slide. Thank you very much. So we made eight recommendations in total, and the first four on the slide you can see on the screen. So we've suggested that HMPPS ought to review the target operating model. That's the way in which that's the framework around which it conducts its business. And we've suggested that's important because we want it to meet the organisation, that is, to meet the needs of people on probation and deliver effective services for victims and for local communities. We've suggested that we've recommended that the service take action to ensure that significant risks to probation service delivery are not just identified but acted on effectively. So that good quality intelligence that I made reference to, that senior leaders have access to, we want better outcomes from the actions that are taken in response to that. We've suggested that collaboration between senior HMPPS leaders and other partners ought to improve, particularly in relation to managing men who perpetrate domestic abuse and in relation to safeguarding of children. We've suggested that better systems ought to be prioritised, which are less complex, less cumbersome, and which support the sharing of information with other agencies involved in the protection of people from harm. And I'll move on to the final 4 recommendations. Thank you very much. So the final 4 recommendations are that to provide regional leaders with greater discretion in relation to commissioning and contract management over services locally. We want to see regional probation directors given much more authority to make decisions about how to spend budgets based on what they know about people in their local communities. We've recommended that the commissioning of services should be informed by an accurate understanding of the needs, the risks, and crucially the protected characteristics of people on probation. So we'd like to see the use of diversity data, the use of material about the characteristics of the profile of people on probation used to a greater extent at a national level to inform decision making. We've recommended that the agency seeks more investment in and prioritization of the remediation of unsuitable buildings and estates, including unpaid work sites, to make sure they're all safe and accessible. And then our final recommendation was to make sure that that health and safety responsibilities are identified, controlled so far as reasonably practicable, including things like work-related stress, which is related really closely to high workloads and some of the issues that we came across in our staffing standard. So that is a very rapid and high-level guide through the report that's now published on our website. You'll find on the website tabs for each of those 4 areas that we inspected and all of the recommendations that I've guided you through there. But I think at that point, Martin and Louise, I'll close my mic and pause and hand back to you both for questions and answers.
Dave, and thanks for that really comprehensive overview of the findings of the inspection. And I think it highlights the reasons why this is such an important piece of work. Just to say a few words about sort of the process going forward. Obviously, the inspector has published his report. It's with ministers and with the department for them to consider how to respond. And obviously, we await their action plan in relation to what they will do in response to this. But I do think it's really important that the issues raised in our report are looked at extremely carefully, because if we are to succeed in the kinds of improvements that we would all want, then we need those arrangements to be in place. And I think things like, for example, the safety of buildings, the adequacy of services to meet the needs of people on probation are absolutely vital to get right. Now, in terms of how this is going to work going forward, we've got plenty of time for questions, and hopefully between Dave and I, we can marshal most of those questions. I know we've already seen one question from Anne, but I would encourage other people to put questions on the chat, and then we can hopefully come to those. Louise, you are the hostess with the mostest comparing these. Do you want to sort of lead through this section?
Thanks, Martin. Yeah, should we go to Anne's question first then? And Anne's told she's a recently retired PTA. And the question is there a contradiction between describing initiatives to address staffing having the correct approach, but also that staffing remains an issue? Could this mean that people are not being recruited to the job as it's currently configured, which may contribute to attrition?
Perfect. Well, thank you very much, Anne. I think it's a brilliant question. I will have a first crack at it, and then I'm going to go to Dave, because Dave can then fill in the gaps in any and inadequacies in the answer that I give to you. I think it's a really good point. So when we're looking at these things through a national lens, what we've tried to do is give credit on the basis that there is a huge amount of activity going on in the recruitment space to try to recruit additional probation officers. But in reality, when you turn around and you go to a local PDU inspection, what you still see is really significant staffing deficits along the line. And I think what it goes back to is what are, a number of questions I think that HMPPS need to ask itself. One of which is, why do we see such problems with staff turnover? And why do we get people in, want to work for the probation service, and they're leaving 2 to 3 years later? I think that's a really important question to ask. And obviously we did publish, if people want to have a look at it, our recruitment, retention and training thematic earlier this year that looked at some of those details in greater depth. What I would say as Chief Inspector of Probation is, whilst of course people are doing all sorts of good work to try to improve recruitment, that work needs to redouble to ensure that we're recruiting the right people, but also that those people are supported. I would want the people that we're recruiting now as probation officers to still be here in 10 years' time, because actually that will be the point at which we're really driving forward much better performance of probation officers. I recently went on an inspection, and I think the most experienced probation officer in the team had less than 12 months experience. Now, how difficult is that for a team to deliver the sorts of results that we need them to deliver if you've got a massive dearth of experience within the team? Dave, do you want to come in with any of your observations? You've been on dozens and dozens of inspections and seen the staffing challenges.
I have indeed. Yeah, it's a really good question, Anne. I think what it flags up is that recruitment is only part of the solution. So it's very positive to have more people in the organization, and the number of people continues to grow. But that one of the reasons we're suggesting actually that the agency looks at the target operating model is to make sure that when people are in post and have been trained up, that the demands on those people are reasonable, that the expectations are achievable, that that senior probation officers in particular have got enough capacity to lead their teams effectively and check in with how learning is being applied. So all of that contributes towards what we think is the picture around attrition, and around the quality of work that we're seeing on the front line. So there's been lots of positive work on recruitment, and it's right actually, I think, that we give credit to HMPPS for leading that, because Martin used the term heroic earlier. I think there have been heroic efforts in terms of getting people recruited into the organization, but it's only part of the solution. There's much more to it, and it's as much about the way in which the work is structured, the way in which people are supervised, the space that they've got to apply learning, as it is about getting people through the front door in the first place.
Thanks, Dave. That's really comprehensive, and just having heard your answer gave me another thought, which is about just how much we're asking of the probation service at the front line. And anybody that's been watching any of my remarks that I've been making over the last year will know that one of my concerns is, do we have enough staff to do to control the caseload that the probation service is currently managing? I think it's a huge amount we're asking of people, and I think that feeds through into attrition. If a probation officer is feeling they're managing an unsustainable workload, it's not surprising that actually that affects their wish to stay doing the job. I think it's a really important point, and that's one of the things we're asking them to do, is to ensure there's a better match between what we're asking people to do, the staffing envelope, but also to ensure that that caseload is sustainable and people have the tools they need to focus on the things they need to do. What we need probation officers to do is to spend the time with people on probation. That's the thing that we know from the evidence is going to make the most difference, and we need all the work that's taking place, including some of the digital work. Actually, the thing that I was encouraged by as part of this national inspection is work. If we could get so that each probation officer could save 30 to 40 minutes per case just based on removing administrative bureaucratic burdens, well, that would be hugely transformative to the way in which they do their work, and free them up to do some of the work that they would want to do. The probation officers that I speak to say that some of the form filling and the clunky IT is getting in the way of them doing the job. More questions.
Thank you both. We've got one from Jenny Hudson, an important question, which is what are the next steps to ensure the findings are acted upon and who's responsible for acting on the findings? Will that happen in your view?
Great question. So what I would say is, obviously, as Chief Inspector of Probation, I'll be keeping a close eye on what happens next as part of this. Conversations that have taken place with me over the last sort of 24 to 48 hours suggest that the department is taking very serious note of the findings in this report. Obviously, I report nationally and indeed to Parliament on a regular basis. I'm sure when I next give evidence to the Justice Select Committee, they'll be asking what the response has been to this report. So when I see the action plan and the response to this from the government, I'll be checking that to ensure that I think it's robust enough. And if I'm not satisfied that the right steps are taking place, well, of course, I'll have to ensure that I draw attention to that. What I would say, having spoken to national leaders in HMPPS and some of the people that we've presented the emerging findings, in reality, it would be very surprising if we came up with something here that was completely surprising to people. I think people know, for example, that the particularly, services, the work around IT, for example, needs to improve. The quality of the estate and the pressures on that. People know about that. They want to act upon them. And hopefully, people can use our report to draw attention and perhaps lever in some of the resources that could make a difference on this sort of thing. So watch this space. But actually, this is not a report that should gather dust on the shelf. This is a report that needs to be acted upon urgently.
Thank you. Another question from Naima Malik, which is talking about what problems is probation currently facing with supporting people on probation with mental health conditions and substance misuse, and what future research would support the probation service to deliver better outcomes for those people?
Great question. If I again have an initial look at this question and then ask Dave to sort of supplement this with a more detailed view. I mean, it goes back to our findings on services. In reality, is that we all know from the evidence that there are key drivers why people offend. People don't offend because they're bad people. They offend because of their underlying needs, and those needs tend to be addiction, mental health, homelessness, unemployment. And if every probation officer on this call will know this. If you can act upon those factors, there will be a significant chance that you will improve outcomes as part of that. Now, mental health and drug treatments are absolutely critical. And I think what this report finds is that there is not enough support available at a local level. And it also, I think, links across into the points we've made in relation to sort of national leaders having arrangements in place with other partners. Now, there has been a lot of work taking place over recent years, particularly around mental health treatment, and an increase in the number of offenders given mental health treatment requirements at court. What I would say as Chief Inspector of Probation is, yes, that's all good. We probably need more of it. Dave, you can maybe talk about some of the more detail of this that you see, but certainly when we're out on our local inspections, what we find is not enough work is taking place to tackle the underlying causes of offenders' behaviour, and therefore that leads inevitably to people that are then stuck in that revolving door of reoffending. Dave.
Yeah, listen, I agree with all of that, and it's a great question, Naima. I think just to add to what Martin's already said, one of our findings in this national inspection was actually that the data that national teams are using is unreliable, and that does create problems in terms of creating the evidence base for working with, for example, people with mental health or substance misuse issues. But what we do know is that a very high proportion of people on caseloads locally have neurodiverse issues, mental health issues, and as you mentioned, substance misuse problems. In terms of future research, I mean, I guess that it would be very helpful to understand what types of interventions are particularly effective with people with substance misuse problems, particularly around short-term sentences, around resettlement into the community. But we do see, as Martin was saying, for more integrated working with health partners in particular, to get the strategy in place that enables people at the front line to deliver good quality work for people who have health conditions that are related to their offending. So scope for improvements on that front, which we talk about in more detail in the report on the website.
Thanks very much, Dave, particularly given the fact you picked up the research question, which I ducked as part of mine. So you got a much more comprehensive answer from Dave. Louise, next question.
Thank you. We've got one from Chris, who's a senior practitioner in Jersey, asking whether the better communication at a high level mentioned on slide 11 regarding domestic abuse and safeguarding, does this encompass mental health issues, given SFOs are often linked to mental health cases? And then just one additional question from him, if we can take it off at the same time. Is there a national workload measurement tool?
Perfect. Okay, we're going to divide the labour here because I'll talk to the first question around domestic abuse and SFOs, and then I'll ask Dave to supplement that question. And then Dave's an expert on the National Workload Measurement Tool and what the story is on that. I'm setting him up completely there, aren't I? Chris, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think the one very clear lesson from all the SFO reviews that take place, and actually maybe I should start by saying this, actually, the probation service manages a really complex and difficult caseload, and unlike the people that are being managed in prison, if you're managing people behind bars, at least that risk is contained. The risk that the probation service managed is largely sitting in the community. It's a live risk, and it's a risk that you can't avoid. You've got to manage that. People are being released from prison. You need to manage that risk as part of that. Now, if you look at the raw numbers, and of course we need to be a learning sector that learns from when things go wrong, the reality is the probation service, in large part, manages that risk successfully in the community. The number of SFOs committed by people under the supervision of the probation service is, given the scale of its caseload, low. It's really important. But when you look at the lessons learned from SFO reviews, whether that's conducted locally by SFO reviewers within HMPPS or by HMIP, what you find is primarily where you identify lessons, it's around information sharing. So someone somewhere knew some information that would guide the risk that somebody presents, and it isn't feeding through. It's such a consistent finding. But actually, we were saying that 30 years ago when I started as a civil servant with much more hair than I've got now. I think it's really important that we need to be ensuring that we are providing timely information shared within the system to ensure that we manage those risks. Because also it's about risks to the individuals that are on probation themselves, actually what their vulnerabilities are. What are the risks, for example, that they may be at risk of suicide when they enter custody. Those are really critically important things, and all the reviews are better information sharing leads to better outcomes for the public and for people within the system as a whole. So I think much more needs to be done to ensure timely information sharing, to ensure that the probation officer has the information at their fingertips to make the right decisions. Now, that's not necessarily about sending people back to prison. It's about ensuring that people get the help that they need to deal with the issues that they are facing and to ensure that you have the right plan. What I would also say is this, is actually with one thing getting the information, but the next question which I think we need to address within the sector is, okay, then you've now got the information that somebody may be at a risk of committing domestic abuse offences, so what are you going to do about that? And that's really the level that we need to work on to ensure that people are acting appropriately on the information. Again, it's not about, okay, then how are you going to share that information? What inquiries are you going to make to ensure that that risk can be managed in the community? Mental health is just one of those issues, and I think we could do much better, given the learning from those SFOs, to ensure that information is appropriately shared within the system. Dave, do you want to supplement that and talk about the National Workload Measurement Tool?
Yeah, I won't supplement that because I agreed with every word, Martin. I'll pick up the National Workload Measurement Tool. The short answer is yes, Chris, there is a National Workload Measurement Tool. And when we looked at the data, it's actually been reducing in terms of capacity. So about 12 months before the inspection, nationally, average workloads were about 120% of where HMPPS thought they ought to be. That had reduced to just over, I think it was 106% by the time we inspected, and that reflects, work that's been taking place around prioritization frameworks, around the probation reset scheme, and of course around the number of people that are being recruited into the organisation. But crucially, what we've not seen is an improvement in public protection work. So the time that practitioners need to spend, responding to risk, dealing with risk, acting on risk, isn't yet there. And when we look across our PDU inspections in particular, we're still finding that people are bogged down in process, in systems that are clunky and cumbersome and difficult to use. So the direction of travel is heading in the right direction, and we hope that this report gives a bit more momentum, I guess, behind that reduction in the demands that practitioners are facing on the front line, so that they can focus on what's really important. And I think I will leave the response to that question at that.
Thank you.
Thanks
Welcome,
very
Chris.
much, Dave. We've got a question now from Emma around whether you think that recruitment activities and processes are getting the right people through the door. Our understanding is that most of the processes for PQIP, for example, are outsourced rather than being conducted by probation staff, for instance.
Great question, Emma. It's good that we've got such good questions coming through on the chat. I think it's a really good point, actually, and it's one of the things that we did look at as part of our recruitment, retention and training thematic. I'll keep pushing that as a document that's worth reading. So I think there's a few things. I think certainly there is a risk that unless you get your recruitment activity right and give people a realistic view of what the job of probation involves, that you don't get the right people in. But when you look at the findings of our thematic, what we found actually was that most of the people that we were getting in as sort of trainee probation officers almost had what you would want them to have as their priorities, what they wanted to work on. When you spoke to those that were leaving, they were almost disappointed that the work that they wanted to do wasn't the work that actually was the reality. And what they found was they wanted to spend time working with people on probation, but actually found they were quite often stuck behind bureaucratic form filling and not having the time that they wanted to spend with people as part of that. But I do think there are challenges for the organisation in relation to recruiting a wide spread of people and ensuring that they manage that. I mean, we know that a large part of the people being managed by the probation service, are older men. How do you ensure you've got a workforce that is able to deal with those needs of those individuals properly? I think it's a challenge to ensure that you're constantly challenging to say, are you getting the right people in? But actually, the other thing I would say is, when I joined many years ago, I joined the civil service because I wanted a job, but I fell in love with justice. And actually, I wanted to make a difference in the sector because it's in my blood now. I want to get better outcomes within the justice system. So even if people are coming in saying, actually, I need a job, how do you ensure that actually you capture those people so they become committed people that want to make a change and they want to stay with the service to 10, 20, 30 years? I think that's what we've got to do. But by doing that, I think what you need to do is ensure that they are supported properly, they're giving the training, and that they're giving them a job that is doable. Dave, again, feed in your reflections on this.
Yeah, again, agree with all of that, Matt. The only thing I'd add is one of the things we picked up from this inspection was that, regional directors would appreciate much more flexibility over recruitment. So, they're best placed to understand their local communities and what it is that they need for the people that they supervise. So there was a kind of lack of flexibility around that front. But Martin's absolutely right. Whoever you get in through the front door, what's crucial is how those people are trained up, how they're supported, the opportunities that they're given to kind of consolidate learning into practice, and against the backdrop of really high workloads, lots of complexity in terms of process, a kind of lack of effective action from the top in terms of leaders on public protection. You can see how space for that consolidation of learning is really affected. So yeah, that's all I'd add to that one, Martin.
I guess the final observation I'd make on that, which is back to what that local need is. I was recently on one of our inspections in Lincolnshire. So actually, how far can national inspection take account of the fact we need somebody that's going to be able to go into the probation office in Skegness? How do you do that if you're recruiting nationally? So that's a specific set of skills. You need some really targeted work to ensure that you get people. Interestingly, I have seen some good models where there's, for example, link up with local universities to identify, okay, then, so who are the sorts of people that are at university that might be interested in working in that, but also within those local communities, who are the people that you could perhaps call upon that you think actually could become and make a difference in the probation service? Thank you. Next question, Louise.
Thank you. We've got a hand up from Sue McConnell, Sue, if you'd like to come on to camera and ask.
Thank you. My system isn't working very well, so you're stuck with me. Two things really. The first is this whole discussion and everything we're talking about is skewed very much to to what happens after sentencing, and in particular what happens after a custodial sentence. So I'm just wondering if any attention is being paid, or whether you have any observations about the work we should be doing upstream of that in courts, and how that is working to divert people from prison in the first place, which we know is the worst place to start any journey of rehabilitation. And my second question, pile them in, is have you given any thoughts to, or do you have any observations about the proportion of back office to coalface? Because the from members of my union is that the core business, which is offender management, frontline, aren't being made. So there are a lot of silos of people working in improvement initiatives, quality, and all those sorts of things that you can think up any number of different projects to the detriment of the core business, which any commercial manager would say is the one thing you should not neglect. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sue. Two great questions. Again, I'll have a first pop at these, and then ask Dave to then correct anything that I say that isn't quite right, or that he can supplement. So I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think the work at court is absolutely important, and I think, you know, I know there is work that goes on with sentencer engagement, but actually you can't do enough of it. I spent 8 years of my career working in the courts and tribunal service, working with judges and magistrates. You know, we need to ensure that we improve the understanding of judges of the reality of sentence, that community sentences are extremely effective, much more effective according to the data than short custodial sentences at breaking those cycles of reoffending. It's a really important area, and you need to build that trust and confidence. Now, my fear is that the last 10 years of turmoil that we've seen within probation has knocked that confidence, and we need to rebuild that. Now, I've already had some of those discussions with senior judges, and I will continue those conversations, but it also needs to be taking place at a local level too. The other thing that I would say, my other observation of one of the visits that I had, I spent some time in Liverpool looking at their intensive supervision court there, and I saw a judge working hand in glove with probation staff to look at the underlying reasons of people's, you know, persistent offending, you know, drugs, mental health, all of the things that we know are the key causes. And you saw, you know, men, predominantly men, actually, although there was a lady in the court, you know, talking about the progress and all sorts of different stages of their journey. But the very strong message you got back from the judges was that this work had improved significantly their trust and confidence in the probation service for people that they would otherwise have sent to custody, probably for, you know, potentially a couple of years. And actually, you got to the end of it and you saw some of the men that were making, you know, significant progress in relation to their addictions and their difficulties, much less likely to be costing the criminal justice systems hundreds of thousands of pounds in the future. We need to absolutely redouble our work as part of that to ensure that we get better outcomes as part of that. So this is the reason why this is important. This is the reason why we did this report, actually, is because we need to ensure that we invest in that local community stuff, because if not, you know, we end in a world in which we've got, you know, well over 100,000 people in prison, and we still have depressingly high reoffending rates. If you want to break the back of reoffending, it has to be done by the probation service, and it needs to be invested in. In terms of the balance between frontline work and the back office work, well, what I would say is this. I think the way I used to approach it when I used to run Crown Court operations, I used to think of it in terms of, you know, every pound that we spend, we need to focus on doing the frontline job of delivery. Now, of course, you know, backroom admin stuff that assists people in doing the work to a high standard is important, but actually the emphasis throughout this should be ensuring that we have probation officers doing the job on the front line, because that's where you will make the difference as part of that. Now, of course, what I would want is to ensure that there's support for that work, so good training, for example, to ensure that people are doing things and properly supported, but that needs to be where the priority is, in my view, and I say that as the chief inspector. Dave, do you want to supplement that in any way?
Yeah, two really good questions again, Sue. Just on courts, I mean, we didn't comment specifically on report writing or court practice in this national inspection, but if you look at our regional reports, you'll see we comment routinely on, you know, pre-sentence report quality, on advice to courts. We see that as being crucial. You know, the number of PSRs commissioned has declined significantly. There's big opportunities for demand management at court in terms of getting people on the right orders with the right kind of requirements and the support that they need, or actually diverting people away from supervision or is it RAR days as it's now known, where actually it's not necessary and not likely to be helpful. On the point about silos, we did comment on this in this national inspection, and we were concerned that lines of accountability, particularly around the quality of public protection practice, were blurred or confused, and that was having an impact in terms of frontline practice. So there is certainly work to be done around being clear about who is responsible for particular streams of work, how they expect those streams of work to be reported back on, and what the intended effects of those are. We didn't make comment in terms of the ratio of backroom staff or non-operational staff to frontline staff, but I think the section on staffing speaks for itself in terms of Martin's earlier point about there just being too few people with too much to do across wide areas of the probation service at the moment. So I think that's all I'd add to your already helpful response, Martin.
Perfect, Dave. Fantastic.
Thank you.
Louise, take it. Thanks, Sue. Great question.
We've got a question from Laura Fletcher, which a lot of people have pushed up the list, which is how do we make these changes in your view in what feels like a firefighting environment? Over just 1 year, we've had Reset, ECSL, SDS 40, Impact, etc.
Gosh, Laura, you asked the most difficult question of all, because that's the thing that I guess I remain concerned about. I mean, I guess I can easily see the world that we'd want to be in 5 years' time, actually, where I'd want significantly better resourced probation service dealing with a manageable caseload, with a sort of stable path with modern tools. How do we get there? And that's my question. And I think part of this is taking a really, really hard look through the sentencing review at what we're asking the probation service to do. Now, I think, and I think I originally started talking about it, saying, how do you trim the work of the probation service to ensure it's focused on the work that really matters? And I don't think that's the right word. I don't think we can trim it. I think we need to cut it back quite hard, perhaps by 25 to 30%. Now, of course, the work, the probation service, there's all sorts of always attractions and reasons why we want to do things. What is it that we need them to do? I think if we could reduce the amount we're asking them to do by 25 to 30%, that would give them an opportunity to do much, much better. And around change, I think you make a really, really important point. I can see the fatigue. I see, of course, all the letters that go out to people informing them of the latest change program. Now, of course, there's reasons for that. The SDS 40 change, a really important change to ensure that our prisons did not run out of spaces. But in reality, placing massive additional pressure on the probation front line. And whilst people performed heroics, and I know this from the work that we saw during our inspection program, it's just not sustainable. And I think one of the questions that we need to be asking, and the probation inspectorate certainly need to be looking at this, is how effectively those programs are paced to ensure that anything that is then taking place is actually supporting the delivery at the front line and done in such a way that it is manageable. The other thing that worries me about some of the changes is if they're being implemented very, very quickly, and that's just building the pressure that people feel under as a result of the changes. So I think we need to be very carefully the changes that are being made, and certainly I think the next 18 months in particular are absolutely critical to getting that pacing right. The other thing that I would say is really important in that period is to ensure that we don't increase the level of losing staff within the probation service as well, because you can see, and I know somebody else has asked the question of why are we seeing such turnover, such an increase in stress. Well, that is part of it. It's workload and change. It has an impact on people. So actually we need to ensure that we properly support probation practitioners, probation leaders at a local level to ensure that they can manage through what is going to be a really challenging time. And that's the reason why the outcome of this report, I think, is a really important one for people to take notice of. Dave, do you want to add to that?
No, I don't think I can, Martin. I agree with all of that. But just to kind of recognise, I guess, Laura's point that we see the impact day in, day out through our inspection work of near constant change. And as Martin said, actually, the last thing we'd want is for additional layers and processes to be added in response to this report. In fact, the opposite is probably true, that ways of finding space, of doing less with particular groups of people is probably the way forward. And of course, we'll be working with national leaders and monitoring the impact of any changes through our core inspection work as we deliver our programme.
Dave, the only thing that I would supplement as part of that, again, having heard your brilliant answer to the question, one of the things that I can understand why it's happening, but actually I think we need a different answer to that, is some of the changes, for example, impact and some of the probation reset changes are attempting to sort of change the ambit of the work of probation. Now, I understand why people are doing that in the short term, but actually what we need is legislation to actually fundamentally change the workload. And one of the questions I've asked, and I'll fess up, I was involved in 2014 in the creation of the Offender Rehabilitation Act 2014. My question, a really hard question for ministers and government, is have we created an unsustainable amount of workload for probation that needs to be absolutely fundamentally reviewed in relation to all sorts of very desirable work? Do we have the resources to do it, or should we be taking some of those cases out of the probation service? Now, I can see all sorts of implications for that, but I think we need to ask ourselves those hard questions. So rather than a programme of change, we just simply say, actually, these cases will no longer be with the probation service. Now, of course, that has implications. I know lots of people do some fantastic work with some of those people, but are we resourced to do it? I think that's a really difficult question, but it's certainly one of the things that I fed in as part of my response to the sentencing review. Lou, next question.
Thank you. We've got a hand up from Mark Swain.
Hi, Mark. Ask away.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, Dave. Good afternoon, Martin. The first one was just two questions. So the first one, Dave, earlier you said that the data used by national teams was unreliable. I just wondered whether you might expand on that in terms of why you think that's the case. And the second question is just with regard to there being an appetite or an intent for HMIP to do a follow-up inspection around obviously the national inspection. Thank you.
Dave, do you want to go first?
I'd love to. And hello, Mark. Nice to hear from you. In terms of that unreliability, there are a number of reasons why we say that. A lot of this comes from the front line that's then fed into national teams. There's improvements to be made in terms of the way in which information is gathered and in the way in which it's categorized. But more importantly, the impact is that it undermines the evidence base, I guess, for national leaders making strategy decisions, making decisions about the delivery of services at the front line. So that's kind of it's our concern is less actually about the way in which the data is collected and more about the use of that data as an evidence base for making decisions. And Mark, I've got to confess, I've forgotten the second part of your question. Oh, appetite for a second. Dave. Brilliant, perfect, thank you.
So, Mark, I think the second part of your question was, do we have the appetite to come back again and look at these things, progress maybe a year or so down the line? And the answer is absolutely yes. Given the change that's currently underway within the probation service, I have an open mind in relation to coming back and looking at these things, or indeed exactly what we would look at. I mean, given some of the changes that we've talked about today and the impact of the sentencing review, I think it would be healthy for the system to see how some of those changes are being implemented. That would be helpful for the public. And of course, it's helpful to know how is it taking place and how is it impacting on an individual PDU. But lifting the view sometimes is really helpful to understand what are the pressures facing the service as a whole. Because I would say, from seeing many PDU inspections on the ground, is every PDU is led differently. Every PDU faces different challenges, but some of the challenges they face are endemic across the service. And that's the reason why I think you need to look nationally, because I think a lot of the answers lie there rather than in the control of a local PDU head. Thank you. Great question. Lou, we've probably got time for one more question, maybe two if we're quick.
I was going to say they're going to need to be very fast responses. We've got a question from Peter Rayner saying, you found that managers didn't prioritise necessarily the reduction of reoffending, and why do you think that was?
Dave, do you want to answer this question first of all, and then I'll come in off the back of anything you want to observe on the whole thing, because I know this is something that we've discussed.
Well, yeah, it's a really good question, Peter. This is not for the want of trying, and it's not because managers aren't interested in the reduction of reoffending, or indeed the public protection work. What we found was actually there was the way in which the strategies that had been set at a national level was such that it just wasn't leading to the outcomes that national leaders were hoping for. And when you think that the target operating model has been in place now since unification, which is several years ago, we think there are opportunities at this stage in the lifespan of HMPPS for national leaders to think through, well, actually, is this way of operating is the direction we're setting nationally leading to what we want to take place at the front line and what we expected by this point. So if you look at the way in which CRS has been delivered, we're still seeing at PDU, so CRS is commissioned rehabilitative services, we're still seeing at PDU levels that the relationships aren't necessarily always there with CRS providers and probation practitioners. And I made the point earlier that for a local regional level, we see much more opportunity for the service to give authority to heads of community integration and regional probation directors to commission services based on what they know about their communities. So it wasn't that leaders were not prioritizing it or recognizing the importance of a reduction of reoffending. It was that the action that was being taken at a national level just wasn't leading to the to the outcomes that they hoped for, and not enough evaluation had taken place to check whether they were as effective as leaders hoped they'd be.
Fantastic, Dave. And I'll just supplement that by saying this. Probably if you read the strategies and the strap lines and read the speeches, of course, people talk about protecting the public, people talk about reducing reoffending. My challenge is nuts and bolts on the ground. What work is taking place to keep the public safe and reduce reoffending? And if you look at the evidence base is quite strong in relation to the practical things people should be doing to ensure that they are working as effectively. And a part of it is the workload thing. But I think not enough emphasis is on actually what do we need to do with Mr. Jones to reduce his risk to the public and to reduce the chances that we will reoffend, because actually the evidence base is extremely strong what it is that you need to do. But it's ensuring that probation practitioners have the time, the tools, and indeed the services to call upon to make that difference. And I think if we could do that, we would start to see significantly better outcomes. But it's about moving it on from being a slogan to actually, in practical terms, what is it we are going to do? That would be my challenge. Thank you very much indeed for all of those questions. Hopefully that will give us a good spread of what we found in our national inspection and some of those queries. We're looking forward to seeing what happens next as part of this, but I'm so grateful to everybody for joining us and for those that listen to this subsequently on YouTube. But I hope you all have a pleasant and successful afternoon. Thank you very much for joining us.